So I think we can start. Room seems to be full soon. So welcome everyone. Good afternoon or good morning if you're in the US, good evening if you're in Asia. It's my pleasure to welcome you once again to our EAXIS seminar on macroeconomics, finance, and climate change. Before starting, we also would like to invite you to join the EAXIS forum on Slack. This is a workspace for a community of researchers, regulators, and central bankers working on issues of climate change and the environment. And in this Slack channel, you will find a comprehensive stream of working papers, news, and conference information on these issues. And you can join via the link that we will post in the chat. So today, it's my great pleasure to welcome Benoit Mojon and his co-authors, Thorsten Ehlers and Frank Packer, to present their latest paper that they are published at the Bank for International Settlements. Benoit is head of economic analysis at the BIS since 2018, if I'm not mistaken. And before joining the BIS, he worked at the Banque de France, where he was first head of the monetary policy division, and then director of monetary and financial studies, as well as a member of the Eurosystem Monetary Policy Committee. Before that, he held a research position at the Federal Bank of Chicago and the European Central Banks. And Benoit is holding a PhD in economics from the University of Paris, Nanterre. And he has studied at the University of Aix-Marseille and Sciences Po. He was also an adjunct professor at École Polytechnique and INSEAD. So today, Benoit, you will present your most recent paper, Green Bonds and Carbon Emissions, exploring the case for a rating system at the firm level. And I think that this is a very timely contribution. I think this audience is very aware that in terms of climate change and financial markets, there seems to be a market failure. A lot of central bankers have claimed that financial markets do not fully account for climate risk, for example, in asset pricing. And one of the reasons for that is a lack of data and a need for better and more comprehensive data. And then you address this issue in your paper. You present one suggestion that could be an important milestone for having a comprehensive data set, at least the beginning of a comprehensive data set that can be used by every investor, as well as central bankers and regulators to assess climate risk or climate objectives. And you discuss the pros and cons and what feature should such a measure have. Before we start the seminar, I would like to ask the audience two questions that will appear. Yes, here they are. If you can take a few minutes to answer them. And they relate to the presentation and will give us a hint or some indication about what the audience is thinking. The first one is, in your opinion, are the dominant green bond standards strict enough to direct financial inflows to low carbon activity? And the second one, ideally, what should a firm level climate index measure? You have the possibility of multiple choice. I think that will give us some indication about what people think before you go in your presentation, and maybe you will have the opportunity to change their mind after that. Let's wait. Yeah. And before we get the answers, let me also tell you that you can ask questions in the Q&A section of Zoom, and I will relay them to Benoit and his co-authors after the presentation. So maybe we can have the results now. So apparently there is a majority thinking that green bonds are not strict, standards are not strict enough to direct financial flows to low carbon activity. And what should firm level climate measure? The majority is for measure about the alignment to international goals. And second, current and past CO2 emission. Okay. With that in mind, the floor is yours, Benoit.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Maybe Adrian can pass me the ability to share my screen so that I can upload my presentation. Yeah, now it's coming, so I guess you can see it. Slideshow.
Yes, we can see it now.
Thank you. Yes. So let me begin. So this thanks a lot for this very nice invitation to present this work, which is joint work with Torsten and Frank. Both are on the call today, but Frank is based in Hong Kong, so preferably if there are difficult questions, we would resort to Torsten, who is in Europe, as I am. And so basically, this is a piece which appeared in the quarterly review of the BIS in September 2020, and basically it focuses on one specific aspect of the green finance, which is a bond market, and more specifically the label of green bonds that a subset of the bond market is having. So moving to the next slide. What is it that we do here in this paper?
Benoit,
we're going to look on green bonds.
Sorry,
yes.
Sorry, we don't see you moving your slide. I think you're still on the PowerPoint application.
Okay. Can't you see my my second slide on screen now?
No. So I guess
okay.
You have to upload again and not go on the PowerPoint, but on the.
Yeah, I can go on.
Yeah.
Sorry, I will change. I have it here. Okay, so let me come back to you on this. Sorry, so let me share differently now with. So can you see this one?
Yes. Yeah. Yes, we can. Yeah. So now. Yeah.
Just 1 second, please. Okay, so I guess now you see almost full screen.
Almost full screen. Yeah, we see the PDF layout. Yeah, that's good.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry about that, guys. So yes. So basically, yes, the view I expressed today are the views of the authors, not the one of the BIS. It's an important disclaimer. So yes. So what do we want to focus on? We focus on green bonds and the question of whether green bond issuers are greener in the sense that having issued a green bond shows that a firm emit less carbon, or that it is on a trajectory of reducing carbon emissions more or faster than comparable firms or other firms from its sector over time. And this is particularly important for central banks. For those of you who are not fully aware what the BIS is, so the BIS is owned by 63 central banks. And basically, it's a place where central banks discuss on policy issues and regulation of the financial system, supervision rules, and so on and so forth. That's the Basel Committee, which set the standards for the supervision of the banking system. And it's also a place where central banks meet to discuss their issues in terms of monetary policy and financial stability. And a little bit more than a month ago, you had in this webinar, you invited Giovanardi and his co-authors to present a study on the preferential ECB treatment of green bonds by the ECB. And in this paper, these researchers found that there was an effect of preferential treatment announced by central banks. So what central banks do in terms of green finance is likely to have an important effect on financial markets. And this study, which was presented in this e-Axis forum a month ago, shows evidence that it has been the case in the case of the ECB. So now, is it the case that green bond issuers reduce the carbon emissions either over time or relative to other firms that do not issue green bonds? And the answer to this question is generally no, as I will show today in this presentation. I want to stress that it's an unfair question in some respects, because some green bonds actually are not meant to reduce carbon emissions. You can issue, for instance, a green bond for a project which is going to be helping recycle water or preserve forests or biodiversity, and the term green bond for such projects, a project that would favor biodiversity, is not directly related to green gas emissions. Okay, so what we show is that green bond does not mean that you're going to reduce your carbon emissions, but some of those green bonds that we will cover in our study actually were not meant to address carbon emission. This being said, in terms of the big picture and where the financial market is going, it's really important to have a sense of whether green labels or the labels for green bond, what do they mean for broad objectives? What do they mean in terms of impact? Can we relate them to the broad objective of mitigating the increase in temperature due to green gas effect? And so we will look into this and basically advocate, given the relative failure of green bonds to so far contributes to this higher level objective, to think of another system of rating, which is basically different in two respects, in two main respects. One is that instead of a system that relates to the use of proceeds, okay, which is centered on the project, which is financed with the green bond which has been issued, to focus in terms on the issuer. Okay, so it would be the issuer who would be rated or evaluated for its greenness and not specific projects. And the second very important principle that we put forth is that the system of green bonds whereby you are either green or not green is probably not granular enough, not continuous enough, which is not so good for incentives and for readability of what this label means. And instead, a bit like what you see in credit risk, we are advocating for different shades of green or different shades of brown for the firms which are emitting the most carbon, but I will get to that. Okay, so the market that we are talking about, this is, by some accounts, this is large. By other accounts, this is small. As we speak, basically we are approaching $1 trillion of bonds. We are approaching $1 trillion of bonds, which are of green bonds, which are issued across many jurisdictions. Okay, that's what we see here. You have them from the US, you have them from China, you have them from some EU countries, such as France here in yellow, and from others jurisdiction. And you see that there is an acceleration in the issuance of green bonds, which is in part because society at large and investors are becoming more aware of the need to basically mitigate climate change. And this increasing demand that we see, including from central banks who are managing foreign exchange reserves and are very much eager to purchase green bonds. So towards this increasing demand, we see more and more issuance of green bonds. So this is growing fast. By some extent, you could say that this is still small, in the sense that this is only this is still less than 5% of the total amount outstanding of bonds worldwide. Okay, so what are the issues with green bonds? We have basically two high-level issues that have been raised by commentators. One is that there are no binding minimum standards. Actually, we have several definitions of what green bonds can be. And the one which is the most recent and most encompassing, issued by the EU, is this EU Sustainable Finance Taxonomy, which is going towards addressing this issue of lack of minimum standards. The other issue that many commentators have stressed is that given that green bonds are associated to the use of proceeds, it's at the time of the issuance, there is this commitment that you would use the funds raised to a specific project, but ex post, actually, there's no dynamic and ongoing assessment of whether the proceeds were indeed used for the specific project. So there's an issue there, and on this second shortcoming of the current green bond label system, what we do in this study is basically to go and look at what the green bonds meant in terms of carbon emissions of the entities of the corporations which have issued their such bonds. Okay. So in terms of what is different, I mentioned this already, it's a matter of this label, okay? So a green bond is a bond which was able to get this label that it's green in the sense that it's beneficial for the environment, for a specific project. I want to come back to what I said earlier, that this can include adaptation to climate, but also biodiversity or water security. So not all the green bond universe is about greenhouse gas and carbon emissions. So however, given this overarching goal of climate mitigation that we have since the Paris Agreement, and this objective of the Paris Agreement of making finance flows consistent with the pathway toward low greenhouse gas emission and climate resilient developments, we will focus on what green bonds have done in terms of precisely carbon emissions. So there, the standards of carbon emissions, as many of you are already aware of, are defined with these different levels, which encompass a growing effect of the activity of the firm. So the scope one, what's called the scope one carbon emission, relates to the production directly in the control of the firm in its, it's in production processes. That's scope one, which is relatively narrow. Scope two would, on top of that, include the use of energy that the corporate is using in its processes and for the production of its inputs. And then you have even a larger an even larger universe of the decision of the firms, which relates to where it is sourcing, where it is taking its input into its production, and also how it's gonna itself be an input for the production of others. So these are the upstream and the downstream impact of the choices of the corporate. And what we take here is that, of course, it is more difficult to compute scope 3 carbon emissions, and it's still in the making, it's still spreading, but as I will show, for the measure of carbon emissions, the source of information that we use for the measurement of carbon emission, scope 3, the coverage for scope 3 is not as good as the coverage for scope 1 and scope 2, which are easier to measure, but it is very much growing. And as we speak, and even for these data sets that we used last summer, scope 3 emissions were available in our data source for a very large proportion of the 16,000 firms which are covered in our data source, which is Trucost. Okay, so there are those different levels of you can measure the impact of the activity of the firm in terms of emission with a more encompassing definition, which includes not only its own production, but also where it's taking its inputs and where its own production goes afterwards. And so we think that scope 3 is probably the more encompassing measure, is probably the future, as it's better to base the assessment of the activity of the firm on a broader set, which includes all its decision process, and reduce the chances that, because of this carbon emissions and the necessity to appear green to investors, you would do some regulatory arbitrage in a way by basically keeping in your scope 1 and 2 relatively low carbon emissions, but you would tolerate that this is passed on to the companies that you are working with. So you would, in a way, outsource your carbon emissions. Okay, so sorry about that. What's going on here? Okay, so this. So the data that we use, we have this data, which is Trucost. Trucost is now part of S&P global, and it combines firms' own disclosure together with models which have been developed by TrueCost that looks into the production that is done across sectors and apply their own model to verify the disclosure of firms, or basically give their own assessment on the carbon print of firms who do not disclose yet. It covers over 99% of the global market capitalization, and it's good for higher emission scopes, in particular scope 3, which I explained in the earlier slide is in our view where we want to focus our attention as of today. So in terms of green bond data, we build on the work that Thorsten and Frank began 3 years ago. And basically, a green bond is defined as a bond which received a label of being a green bond by one of the 4 agencies which are giving such labels. Okay, so in terms of where we are, you see a very impressive increase in the disclosure of carbon emissions across firms, now reaching over 5,000 firms who are disclosing their carbon emissions. And in terms of percentage of firms, you see that this has been growing as well. That's the graph on the right. There's a decline in 2016, but this is due to increasing the universe of firms which are covered in the database. Okay, so what we want to do is to look at the firms which have issued green bonds. Altogether, we have in the database about 930 green bonds, green bonds, and of which 560 are green bond issuers. And this corresponds to about 231 unique firms. So some firms have issued several bonds. And in terms of years, that's in terms of observations across years, we have over 547 bonds. And this is in a total of, so you see it's a small fraction of all the firms year observation we have in the database. So what do we see using this data? Basically here, we are comparing basically the histograms of bonds, green bond issuers. These are the green bars, with firms who did not issue green bonds. These are the brown bars for different levels of carbon intensity. So, you know, at the left, you have the firms with less than 1 ton of CO2 per million of revenue. And to the extreme right, you have the corporates whose activity imply over 2,500 tons of carbon emissions per million of US dollar revenue. And we are doing those histograms for scope 1 emissions on the left, scope 1 and 2 emissions in the central panel, and scope 3 emission on the right. So let's look at the right panel. There you see that in terms of the proportion of firms which are emitting the highest level of carbon emissions, the proportion is almost the same among green bond issuers and other firms. Okay, so just you know, that's a cliche, but let's say that you are Shell and you produce oil. I'm taking this. I'm making up this example, but you can issue a green bond for a biodiversity project in one part of the world, and if you do, if you do, basically you can issue a green bond even though you are Shell. Okay, and so that's why we would see that among the firms which are high carbon emitters, some of them may issue green bonds because those green bonds are about specific projects. Or if you are even like the worst possible case, a carbon an electricity company which produces essentially with carbon plants, if you issue a bond to do solar panel and basically produce electricity through solar panel or with windmills, for the production of this electricity, you can issue a green bond, even if at the end of the day, it's only 1% of the electricity that you produce. Okay, so in terms of where the green bond issuers are in, we see that, and there it's important to focus on the right of the distribution, the firms which contribute the most to carbon emissions altogether, and I will come back to this. Some of those firms which are very high polluters issue green bonds as much as firms who do not issue green bonds. Now, if we look at whether issuing a green bonds imply that you're going to be greener in the sense that you will reduce your carbon emissions. So here we look at this in two ways. First, across all firms, we compare scope 1 in blue and scope 1 to 3 in yellow. The 3 years before you emit a green bonds and the 3 years after you emit a green bonds. So here, if you look at the plane lines, basically you see that on average you have, especially for the blue guy, that there is a reduction in carbon emissions in the 3 years that follow the emission of a green bonds. For the yellow line, it's true for the first 2 years, but for the third year, you see an increase actually in your carbon intensity with respect to before the year when you emitted the green bonds. In addition, 2 points to stress, the standard deviations here around those trajectories are very large, so we did not report them. Okay, so another way to say that is that given our sample, those trajectories are not statistically, so that in the statistic sense, different from zero, which is something which is also conveyed by the median, which has the dotted lines. You see that in terms of median firm, the carbon emission, the median carbon emission after issuing a bond, it doesn't change. That you did emit a green bond. Now, on the right, if we focus instead of on comparing firms across sectors, it's very striking because for those sectors, industrial, real estate, and utilities, which are among the big emitters, you see that having issued a green bond is followed by an increase. Okay, for industrial and real estate, an increase in carbon intensity. While if you focus on utilities, you see that the brown guys, okay, the brown guys that did not issue a green bond, they reduce their carbon intensity by more than the green guys. So, where we stand, so we have this universe of 231 green bond issuers. We could compare them to firms who did not issue a green bonds. We did this across all firms, but we did this also within sectors for those emitters. And basically, altogether, it's not the case that green bond issuers are either greener in the sense that we find a high proportion of green bond or as high a proportion of green bond issuers among the firms which are very high level of carbon intensity, the ones on the right of the distribution. And in addition, green bond issuance is not associated with a significant reduction in carbon intensity. So again, this is to some extent somewhat unfair, because some of those green bonds may not be related to carbon emissions, but in terms of relating this label, being a green financial product to the high level objectives such as the Paris Agreement objective, we see that green bonds are not a good signal for investors if they want that the investment have an impact specifically on carbon emissions. The evidence so far, and this is a market which is only in its infancy, but so far actually the performance of green bonds with respect to the specific objective of reducing carbon emissions has been relatively disappointing. So with this in mind, what can we, what do we propose? Okay, so the first element of our proposal is that the rating should not be project-based, but should be based with the entity, with a firm, because the people who decide at the firm level, if we want to go to the Paris Accord, we need that the full set of the decisions, those very influential people who are managing large corporations, the ones which are traded on financial markets, if we want to align the incentives of those decision makers with the Paris Accord, we need to have an assessment of their performance which would relate to the full set of decisions that they are making as decision makers. And we think that there's a full literature in corporate finance that shows that the people who are making those decisions, who are managing, the CEOs and the managing teams of large corporations, they are very sensitive to the stock market, how investors trust their choices or not. So, this incentives on those decision makers through financial markets can be extremely powerful, but we don't want to lure investors with labels which actually say little about the overall trajectory of the firm. So we'd like to have this rating at the firm level, and we'd like this rating to be aligned with a high level objective. Okay, so that's a very important property, which other people in the field have already stressed, and I want to mention here the Climate 100 plus Climate Action 100 plus focus. So these are people who are evaluating stocks, so it's not bonds, okay? But in their current communication, they emphasize that they focus on 160 corporates worldwide. Okay, so here in our study with TrueCost, we are covering 16,000 firms. What those investors are doing around the Climate Action 100 plus is to focus on 160 corporates, which are the firms which account for 80% of carbon emissions. Okay, and basically the progress they are making on those firms, and specifically in those sectors which are emitting a lot of carbon, is very impressive. I think what we also believe that if we want to align the rating system to this high level goal of that relates to climate, the rating system should not be, on the small the small IT company we develop apps, because that's not emitting a lot of carbon, if at all. It should be on cement. It should be on electric companies, on utilities, on the corporates, which are actually the brownest, because if those guys change the production process, the benefit in terms of reducing carbon emissions would be the biggest. So, this is something which I assume in this crowd, many people would be very familiar with. I'm just backing what I just said. The 1% firm on the right here, the 99%, so the 1% of the firm in the sample, which are the polluting the most, the ones with the highest carbon intensity, they account for 40% of carbon emissions. Okay, and you see that if you would focus on 10% of the firms here on the right graph, you see that's really where you have the highest carbon emissions altogether, while the corporates on the top the bottom 90% of corporates in terms of carbon intensity, they hardly account for, the share of their emission in total emission is really, really small. So among other desirable properties to help investors make their investment decision, I think simplicity is really key. And that's where actually we see a lot going on now in terms of defining standards, which relates, to credible plans to go towards net zero emissions, and that's part of what some active investors are doing. They engage with the management of the corporates to assess, is their plan to go to zero net emissions sincere? Is it credible? Do they have the right corporate governance to deliver on those ambitious objectives? This is very interesting, but this is very interesting for investors who can invest a lot of time in the in engaging with the management of those corporations. So we're talking about very big investors. For passive investors, such plans, you can understand them, but it's nothing as simple as a credit rating, for instance. If you tell investors AAA, AA, BBB, it's much easier for them to understand than going into all these managerial decision principle and so on and so forth. Okay, so I have this issue with the mouse. Just 1 second. Yes, so and finally, and this relates to what I was saying just a minute ago. You want to be able to assess the progress of corporates over time, and we think that from this standpoint, having like a simple measure on the level of carbon intensity or the level of carbon emission of a firm, which would be reported and compared to what other firms do across the entire universe of firms or within their sector, would be extremely useful for investors to decide where to put their money if they want to have this impact on climate. So just to give an example, so here we use the comparison of scope 1, 2, 3 carbon intensity as of 2018, and basically we just look at different percentile, and we suggest that we can have like 10 categories that goes from quintuple green to quintuple polluting firms, or we could not use a B letter here because triple B is already used for credit rating. But the most polluting firms, the 1% which pollute the most, basically these are guys who in 2018 had a carbon intensity superior to 17,000 carbon ton per million of revenue. Okay, so what we're proposing is that such a grid could be used to assign a rating to firms, and we should fix this rating at levels of carbon intensity so that firms could progress over time. if you always look, if you would always apply a grid that would look at the distribution of percentile, as this distribution should be changing over time, and we are seeing, and we should carry on seeing, that firms are reducing their carbon intensity thanks to the progress of technology and the pressure from society to reduce carbon intensity. Basically, you could always be the worst. While if you are the worst in 18, it could be that in 2025, nobody is in the quintuple P category. Nobody is still producing with a carbon intensity whereby you emit as much as 17,000 tons of carbon per million of revenue or more. So, this would create the incentive for firms to basically try to progress on this grid over time. But that's just an example. On this example, though, what we could do is check its stability, which is something which is important for firms. Actually, here, what you see that it's frequently the case that the number above the diagonal is superior to the number below the diagonal. Which shows that basically some firms are progressing away from the worst categories. Some firms are progressing from the worst categories that you have at the bottom. So it's a relatively stable system, yet you see some progress with, if you look at the bottom right corner of this table, it means that 84% of the firms did stay as a quintuple P from year to year, but 13% of the firms who were quintuple P are becoming a quadruple P, and then 11% of the quadruple P are becoming triple P, and so on and so forth. Okay, so just for the discussion, and I should stop speaking. I spoke already a bit longer than I expected. So we want to have a system which is linked to the effect on carbon emission. So it's outcome based. We think that the decision making in our economic system is the CEO of firms and the management of corporates, and they are very much used to interact with financial markets. So they should be the one accountable to investors, and that's where the incentive from financial markets should be. This should be based on scope 3 rather than scope 1 or scope 1 and 2. And a good system with respect to this goal of reducing carbon emission is a system which is designed to scrutinize the worst emitters and giving a label to corporates that which are in sectors with very little carbon emissions is all nice, but probably of a little effects, and much less. There's much less to gain there in terms of reducing carbon emissions than if we focus on the broadest firms. So basically, and then in terms of simplicity, we think simplicity is important. I'm not completely, I cannot forecast, what will be the mandatory standards, which hopefully will be adopted by many countries by the time of COP26. But we think simplicity is extremely important in this respect. And over time, we may need also to rethink this rating to look not at scope 1, 2, 3, but also scope 4 in terms of the products which are produced by the, what does the output of the firm mean in terms of final consumption goods, and how those consumption goods themselves and their usage are impacting the environment. Thank you very much for your attention. Let me stop sharing so that we can see one another for the questions and answer session.
I can't hear you. Can you?
Pierre, we cannot hear you. Can you hear me? No, doesn't work.
Yeah.
And now, can you hear me?
Yes, now we can hear you.
Sorry, apologies. So, yeah, Miles Parker has his hand raised, so maybe get ready for the question if this is possible technically. In the meantime, I would like to ask a question by Anne Florini, who asked, could you say more about what firms are included in your sample? Is this global, OECD, European? Does it include state-owned enterprise? And is it limited to firm of a certain size?
So the coverage is global, and on state-owned enterprises, I'm not sure. So I'd rather ask Torsten.
Hello? Am I?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. So no, so there are no, I mean, to my knowledge, there are no state-owned enterprises included. So it's really, yeah, as Benoit said, so this is a database on global listed companies, basically. And there is and the state-owned enterprise issue we checked, and there was no state-owned enterprise included. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Now, maybe a question live from Miles Parker. If you can unmute yourself and ask your question, Miles. You muted right now, so.
But given that Miles is among attendees, I'm not sure whether he can unmute himself on his own. Maybe the host can do that. I'm not sure whether Miles himself can do that.
I cannot do it. So while we sort out this problem, let me just ask you one question on my side. So you might be aware that in the context of what central bank are doing or are researching in terms of how to integrate climate consideration, there is two kind of narrative. One, a lot of central banks would like to measure climate risks associated with firms and assets. And there is also discussion about not including only risk, but also the alignment of these firms to achieve a policy goal. And I was wondering, where do you see your measure best fit? So can it be used from a pure risk measurement perspective or from an alignment perspective? And then basically, how would you recommend central banks and maybe financial regulators to use the metrics that you propose in their monetary policy operation or in risk in financial risk overseeing?
So thank you, Pierre. These are very difficult questions. Let me try to give a sense of what we do and how it may fit. So the scale that we propose is based on alignment. Okay, that's based on alignment. We can expect that alignment to the Paris Agreement will become some form of constraining laws outside the remit of central banks. So governments can decide that not only the reporting should be mandatory, but they, and everyone is calling for that. And I'm not sure how many countries will implement something of this kind. But the carbon price is called by many observers and commentators. We see countries like Canada who already put in place something that relates to a carbon price. But it's likely that at some point there will be a binding constraint to be consistent with alignment measures. What we see from financial markets, or one type of risk financial markets relate to the anticipation of regulation and late in terms of behind are likely to be dumped by investors. So this is creating a position risk. Will be more likely this certain risk, which would be more likely.
Benoit, I'm not hearing you anymore. Is that only me, or is it someone else as well? So Benoit, I think we didn't hear the last 10 seconds of your answers. You're breaking off.
Oh, so you could not hear me? Sorry.
For the last 10 seconds, probably, of your answers, but now it seems to be clear. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So sorry. That's I was saying that not being aligned, a rating that is related to alignment. It's not related to risk per se. Okay. It's likely to inform transition risk, and a specific transition risk, which is related to, at some point, nobody will want to have the stigma of being brown. No asset managers will want to have in its portfolio a corporate stocks or bonds issued by a corporate that maybe he won't be able to sell on the secondary market, because no one will want to have the stigma of having such a brown firm in its portfolio. So the usage for if this type of rating, which is anchored on alignment, okay, not on risk per se, comes to life and is used broadly, it would be useful indirectly to inform the specific credit risk.
So that could be used as a proxy, but not a full proxy of transition risk, for example. It could be a
Torsten, do you want to add something?
Yeah, so I think, the way that we think our rating could be useful is really in the way that it's simple. You don't. So, for instance, if you want to measure climate risks or alignment, you certainly need a model, because both are forward-looking, right? And then, of course, the next issue with a forward-looking measure is that you would have to verify whether the firms that you assessed are actually fulfilling the promises they made, which also is going to create difficulties. So our rating is basically a shortcut to all these issues, because we are sort of measuring ex post whether firms have actually been improving. Now you can say, well, that may not be enough for me. I actually want to have a forward-looking measure, which is fine. But I think the beauty of this approach is its simplicity. There is no modeling uncertainty here. Okay. There's perhaps an issue with measurement, but as Benoit said, I think we all agree that the measurement is getting better over time. We'll have better coverage. So I think this is kind of this is where we're coming from, basically.
Thank you very much. So we're slowly coming to the end of the seminar. I just would like to ask you one question based on your results. So you show that so basically green bonds are not equal to a reduction of emission by firms. At the same time, like central bank, like the ECB, is always emphasizing that they are buying green bonds, and that is in line with that is something good for the transition, and that's something that they can do. So your result would be a bit dampening this optimism in a sense. All right.
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, one title of glory that we can claim is that Christine Lagarde mentioned the study in an interview in October, and she said that it was extremely difficult to that greenwashing was a very serious issue. And she mentioned our study as an example that greenwashing was something that we needed to be very careful about. And what I can say is that in our own green bond funds at the BIS, which is one of the biggest and maybe even the biggest in existence as we speak, we have higher standards than the green label itself. The green label is not enough. It's a necessary condition. It's not a sufficient condition to be in the portfolio. And from what Christine Lagarde was saying in this specific interview, she sounded like this would be also very much on their radar when making purchases. It's not enough that you purchase green bonds. I just want to say one word on green bonds. I think they really serve the purpose in terms of awareness. Is it only green bonds? Probably not, but we see awareness on these issues growing exponentially. This year, I anticipate very major progress, concrete progress with the IFRS consultation, with the COP26, where heads of states will want to make announcements on this concrete progress. And in my view, green bonds have served this purpose of demonstrating the appetite of investors for green bonds. And now we need to refine what green bonds are, and the type of rating system that we propose would go in that direction.
And Pierre, if I may add to this, we are not. I think the market has also gotten that this is an issue, and new products have been developed, and they're being developed very quickly. In particular, in the space of let's say bonds that signal alignment or a certain degree of transition, and that's certainly something that is missing. Also, as we point out, and we offer like a simple solution, but of course, other people are working on other solutions. So it's not that we are alone in proposing this, and I think central banks have also gotten this message. So I think what we might see is, either we have a further development of the taxonomy for green bonds. So for instance, impact reports. So something that will tell you whether certain goals have been achieved or not is something that's sorely missing right now. Or, we'll have different products in the market that address this issue head on from the start. So we'll see. But I think our point is about simplicity. There's if you have a simple measure, it's something that is very hard to dispute. So this may also have some appeal. We'll see.
Well, thank you very much. We are a bit over time, but I hope it's okay with you. There are still a few questions in the Q&A section by Patrick Flynn and Noemi Berger. I'm sorry not to ask them. Maybe I can suggest the authors to ask this question in the Slack channel, where everybody can answer, and I think that they are great questions to generate feedbacks from other participants to the Slack channel. That being said, thank you a lot, Benoit and Torsten, again for your presentation. The next presentation will be on May 3rd, where Professor Hélène Ray from the London Business School will introduce her work on independent carbon council. And in the meantime, let me once again invite you to join the Slack channel to continue the discussion, and otherwise see you in the next e-Axis webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pierre. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.